Man saves boy abandoned in an old house and discovers the truth that made him cry. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old house as Alejandro stepped over the threshold. A single beam of light pierced through the dust swirling in the air, illuminating the remnants of a life once lived within these walls. The wooden floor creaked under his weight, almost as though the house itself protested his arrival. Alejandro stood still for a moment, taking it all in, the peeling wallpaper curling away like dead leaves, the jagged holes in the walls where sunlight leaked through, the faint odor of damp wood mixed with something unplaceable, faintly metallic, as though the house were weeping. This was no sanctuary, at least not yet. But Alejandro had come here to escape, to bury himself in solitude. After a life marked by heartbreak and routine, he longed for a place as broken as he felt, a blank slate where he could mend his spirit without the expectations of the world. The house, abandoned and decaying, seemed to mirror his state of mind, a hollow shell, worn but still standing. He had bought it for a price too good to be true, though the villagers had murmured warnings of misfortune and tragedy. He had dismissed them. He didn't believe in ghosts, at least, not the kind that haunted houses. On his first night, exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he fell asleep on a mattress he had dragged into the living room, wrapped in silence so profound it felt oppressive. Yet, not long after the house settled into darkness, Alejandro woke abruptly, heart pounding. A sound had pulled him from his dreams, soft, tentative, almost like footsteps. He sat up, straining to hear. The noise came again, a faint shuffle, the scrape of something brushing against the floor. It wasn't the wind, nor the house creaking. It was deliberate, human. Gripping the flashlight beside him, Alejandro rose to his feet. "Kuyen anda ahi," he called, his voice cutting through the silence, thick with sleep and unease. No answer. Only the sound of his own breathing and the distant whistle of the wind through the broken roof tiles. He moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, the beam of his flashlight sweeping the room. The dining area lay untouched, chairs overturned and a thick layer of dust on the table. The kitchen showed no signs of disturbance, save for the occasional scurry of mice darting into corners. But near the back of the house, close to the narrow, decrepit staircase that led to the basement, Alejandro saw something, a faint trail of dirt leading to the shadows. Curiosity mingled with apprehension as he descended the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The basement was colder, the air heavier. The scent of damp earth hung thick, mingled with something faintly sour, like spoiled milk. His flashlight swept across the room, revealing piles of discarded wood and old tools. Then, it caught something else, a blanket, ragged and crumpled in the corner, and next to it, a small tin can, its contents licked clean. His heart tightened. Someone had been here. No, someone was still here. "Salda ahi." "No te herdano," Alejandro called, his voice firm but as gentle as he could manage. For a moment, silence answered him. Then, out of the shadows, he saw it, a small figure huddled behind a broken crate, half hidden but unmistakably human. It was a boy, no older than 5. His clothes were little more than rags, caked with dirt. His face was thin, gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days, and his dark eyes were wide with fear, glinting in the dim light. Alejandro froze, his breath catching in his throat. The boy didn't move, didn't speak. He only stared at Alejandro, clutching something close to his chest, a broken toy car, its paint chipped and wheels missing. It was a fragile, heartbreaking sight. "What are you doing here, niño?" Alejandro whispered, lowering his flashlight slightly so as not to frighten him further. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he shifted slightly, shrinking further into the shadows like a wounded animal. Alejandro crouched slowly, keeping his distance but lowering himself to the boy's eye level. "Estás seguro aquí," he said softly. "No te voy a hacer daño, tienes hambre." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small sandwich he had packed earlier. He unwrapped it and placed it gently on the ground, pushing it forward. The boy's eyes darted to the sandwich, his thin fingers trembling as he reached for it cautiously. Watching the boy eat with such desperation, Alejandro felt a knot tighten in his chest. How had this child ended up here, alone in the cold, decaying basement of a house no one had entered in years? The boy spoke no words, but as the sandwich disappeared in seconds, Alejandro realized the child was more than just lost. He was abandoned, left to fend for himself in the cruelest of circumstances. As Alejandro stood, he glanced around the room once more, his gaze lingering on the blanket and the small collection of scavenged items, a rusted tin can, a few scraps of paper folded into shapes, a makeshift pillow stuffed with leaves. This was not the temporary shelter of a runaway or a lost child. This was a home. The boy had been here for a long time. And Alejandro, standing amidst the ruins of his new house, felt the weight of a decision settle over him. This boy, alone and invisible to the world, had somehow become his responsibility. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the grime-coated windows of the house as Alejandro stood in the kitchen, watching the boy through the open doorway. Lucas, he had whispered his name when Alejandro asked softly the night before, sat curled in the corner of the living room, the same broken toy car clutched tightly in his hand. He hadn't said another word since. Alejandro poured a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process the events of the previous night. He glanced at the small plate of bread and fruit he had set on the table for Lucas, but the boy hadn't touched it yet. The silence between them felt heavy, punctuated only by the faint creaks of the old house settling. Lucas's thin frame was hunched, his knees pulled up to his chest. He watched Alejandro cautiously, his dark eyes darting between him and the open window, as if calculating an escape route. The sight twisted something deep in Alejandro's chest. This wasn't just fear, this was a child who had learned to survive by trusting no one. Taking a deep breath, Alejandro walked over slowly, crouching a few feet away. "Lucas," he began, keeping his voice low and steady. "You don't have to be scared. I'm not going to hurt you." He pushed the plate of food closer, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "You can eat. It's for you." The boy didn't move at first. His gaze flicked to the plate, then back to Alejandro, and then to the door. But hunger was a powerful force, and after a long pause, Lucas reached out with trembling fingers, snatching a piece of bread and retreating back into himself. Alejandro didn't push further, he simply sat there, watching as the boy devoured the food in small, quick bites. "Do you live here?" Alejandro asked gently, though he already knew the answer. The makeshift bed in the basement, the empty cans and scavenged scraps, it was clear Lucas had been living in the house for some time. The boy didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the floor. Alejandro sighed, leaning back against the wall. His thoughts raced, filled with questions that had no immediate answers. Who had left this child here? How long had he been alone? And, most pressing of all, what could he do now? The house, once his refuge, had become a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. Determined to find answers, Alejandro decided to speak to the villagers. They had lived here long before he arrived, surely someone must know something. But as he stepped outside into the dusty yard, he felt a small tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Lucas standing there, his expression unreadable. "You won't leave," the boy whispered, his voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. The question hit Alejandro like a blow. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "I promise." The boy studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly before retreating back into the house. Alejandro watched him go, a heavy resolve settling in his chest. Whatever it took, he would keep that promise. The village, quiet and sun-drenched, seemed almost frozen in time. Alejandro approached an older man sitting on a bench outside the small market. The man looked up, squinting against the sunlight, and offered a curt nod. "Buenos dias," Alejandro began, his tone cautious. "I wanted to ask about a boy. Lucas. He's been living in my house. Do you know anything about him?" The old man's face darkened, his expression shifting to something between pity and discomfort. He gestured for Alejandro to sit beside him. "Lucas," the man muttered, shaking his head. That poor child. He's been on his own for years now. His mother, the man trailed off, his voice heavy with implication. What about his mother? Alejandro pressed, his heart pounding. She was young, barely more than a girl herself. People said she couldn't handle him. Lucas, he's not like other children. Quiet, strange. She used to say he was cursed. One day, she just left him. No one knows where she went. The boy's been fending for himself ever since. The words sent a chill down Alejandro's spine. He thought of Lucas's wary eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, his silence. Cursed? No. Lucas wasn't cursed. He was just a child who had been failed by everyone around him. Why didn't anyone help him? Alejandro asked, his voice rising with frustration. The old man sighed. People here, they have their own problems. And the boy, he kept to himself. Hid in the shadows. By the time anyone realized he was still around, it was too late. He didn't trust anyone anymore. Alejandro clenched his fists, anger and sorrow swirling in his chest. He thanked the man and returned to the house, his mind racing. Inside, Lucas was sitting in the same corner, tracing patterns in the dust with his finger. Lucas, Alejandro said softly, kneeling in front of him. I know you've been alone for a long time. But you don't have to be anymore. I'm here now. I'll take care of you. The boy looked up at him, his expression guarded but curious. For the first time, Alejandro saw a flicker of something in those dark eyes, hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. As the sun set over the dilapidated house, Alejandro sat beside Lucas, vowing silently to uncover the full truth of the boy's past and to build a future where Lucas would never feel abandoned again. The days turned into weeks, and the house began to feel less like a decaying relic and more like a fragile sanctuary. Alejandro worked tirelessly to repair it, patching the holes in the walls and fixing the roof with whatever supplies he could gather. Lucas watched from a distance, his gaze cautious but curious, as if waiting for Alejandro to falter and leave, like everyone else in his short, tragic life had. Despite his silence, Lucas's presence spoke volumes. He followed Alejandro like a shadow, never too close, but never out of sight. At first, Alejandro let him observe, understanding that trust would take time. But slowly, he began to involve Lucas in small tasks, handing him a paintbrush to help cover the faded, peeling walls or teaching him how to hammer a loose nail into place. Lucas was hesitant, his small hands trembling as he mimicked Alejandro's movements, but the faintest flicker of pride shone in his eyes when he succeeded. Alejandro began to notice other things too, patterns in Lucas's behavior that hinted at the depth of his mind. The boy spent hours arranging objects into perfect lines, pebbles, tools, scraps of wood. One afternoon, Alejandro found Lucas in the corner of the yard, building intricate structures out of twigs and leaves, their symmetry astonishing. It was as if the boy saw the world in a language Alejandro couldn't quite comprehend but deeply admired. Yet, even as their bond grew, Alejandro couldn't shake the feeling that the house held secrets. Late at night, as Lucas slept on a small cot Alejandro had set up for him, Alejandro would sit by the dim light of a lantern, staring at the walls and floorboards, sensing the weight of the past pressing against them. He couldn't ignore the whispers from the villagers, the fragments of Lucas's tragic story that hinted at something more sinister. One rainy afternoon, as Alejandro worked on clearing out the basement, his hammer struck something unusual beneath the floorboards, the hollow, metallic thud. Frowning, he knelt and pried up the plank, revealing a small, rusted box buried in the dirt. His heart quickened as he lifted it out, the rain tapping against the cracked basement windows like an impatient reminder. The box was locked, but the old hinges were weak. With a few careful taps, Alejandro managed to pry it open. Inside, he found a collection of papers, yellowed with age and stained by moisture. Among them was a photograph of a young woman cradling a baby, Lucas, unmistakably. Her face was striking, though her expression was tired, her eyes shadowed with worry. Beneath the photo lay a letter, its ink smudged but still legible. Alejandro unfolded it carefully, his breath catching as he read. To whoever finds this, please understand that I had no choice. Lucas is special, so very special, but I can't protect him anymore. They're watching us, following us. I don't know what they want from him, but I'm afraid. I love him more than anything, but if you're reading this, it means I couldn't stay. Please, if you find him, protect him. He deserves so much more than this world has given him. Alejandro's hands trembled as he set the letter down. Who were they? What had this woman, Lucas's mother, been running from? The weight of her desperation seeped into him, and he realized that Lucas's story was far more complex than he had imagined. Later that evening, as Alejandro sat across from Lucas at the small kitchen table, he tried to broach the subject. Lucas, he began gently, do you remember your mama? Lucas didn't look up, his small hands tracing invisible patterns on the table. After a long pause, he whispered, she sang to me. At night. But then, she stopped. His voice cracked on the last word, and he quickly folded into himself, hugging his knees to his chest. Alejandro's heart ached, but he didn't push further. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on Lucas's shoulder, his resolve solidifying. He had to find out what had happened to Lucas's mother. Not just for her sake, but for the boy who had been left to carry the weight of her absence. The next day, Alejandro returned to the village with the photograph and letter in hand. He approached the same old man he had spoken to before, laying the items on the bench between them. Do you recognize her? Alejandro asked, his voice laced with urgency. The man's eyes widened as he studied the photograph. That's Elena, he murmured, his tone heavy with recognition. She was a good girl. Always kind, but troubled. She came here looking for a fresh start, but trouble followed her. What kind of trouble? Alejandro pressed, his patience thinning. The old man hesitated, glancing around as if the walls themselves might betray him. There was a man, he said finally. He claimed to be Lucas's father, but Elena said he wasn't. He wanted the boy. Said he was owed something. No one knows what happened between them, but one day, Elena was gone. And the old man trailed off, shaking his head. He still lives here. Alejandro felt a surge of cold anger. Someone in this village had answers, and Alejandro was determined to find them. For Lucas's sake, he would uncover the truth, no matter how deep or dark it was buried. As he returned home that evening, the house felt heavier, as if it too carried the weight of what Alejandro had learned. Lucas was waiting for him at the door, his small frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. Alejandro knelt and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Lucas, he said firmly, I'm going to make sure you're safe. No one will hurt you again. For the first time, Lucas met his gaze directly. In his dark eyes, Alejandro saw something fragile but unmistakable, trust. And in that moment, Alejandro knew that whatever shadows lay ahead, he would face them for this boy who had already endured more than most could bear. Night descended upon the village, cloaking it in an eerie stillness. Alejandro sat at the edge of his bed, the photograph of Elena resting in his hands. Her face seemed to look back at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that lingered like a ghost in the room. His thoughts churned, each one leading him back to the old man's words. The mysterious man who had claimed to be Lucas's father, what did he want? And why had Elena been so terrified? Lucas slept soundly in the next room, his small frame wrapped in a blanket too large for him. Alejandro had tucked him in earlier, whispering a quiet promise that tomorrow would bring answers. But as the hours crept by, Alejandro felt the weight of his vow. The next morning, Alejandro prepared for what he knew would be a difficult day. He walked Lucas to the small patch of garden they had begun to cultivate together, handing the boy a trowel and showing him how to dig carefully around the seedlings. Lucas nodded quietly, his movements precise, as if the task gave him a sense of order. I'll be back soon, Alejandro said gently, crouching to meet Lucas's gaze. Stay here, okay? If anything happens, go inside and lock the door. Lucas hesitated but finally nodded, his small hand clutching the trowel tightly. Alejandro gave him a reassuring smile before turning and heading toward the heart of the village, where the answers he sought lay hidden among whispers and shadows. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional creak of a wooden sign swaying in the wind. Alejandro's boots echoed on the cobblestones as he made his way to the only place that seemed likely to hold the truth, the cantina. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low hum of conversation. The few patrons looked up briefly as Alejandro entered but quickly returned to their drinks. He approached the bartender, a stout man with a face carved by years of hard work and harder living. "I'm looking for someone," Alejandro said, sliding the photograph of Elena across the counter. "Do you know her?" The bartender's eyes flicked to the photo, and his expression darkened. He glanced around the room before leaning in. "You shouldn't be asking about her," he muttered. "It's not safe." "Why?" Alejandro demanded, keeping his voice low but firm. "Who's going to stop me?" The bartender hesitated, then nodded toward a shadowed corner of the room. "Him." Alejandro turned, his gaze falling on a man seated alone at a table. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from stone. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and they locked onto Alejandro with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. Summoning his courage, Alejandro crossed the room. The man watched him approach, his lips curling into a faint, mocking smile. "You're Alejandro," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "The one who bought the old house. And you're the man who claimed to be Lucas's father," Alejandro shot back, his fists clenching at his sides. The man chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "Lucas," he repeated, as if the name itself were a joke. "That boy doesn't belong to anyone. He's a mistake, just like his mother." Rage flared in Alejandro's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "If that's true, then why were you chasing them? Why was Elena so afraid of you?" The man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold disdain. "She owed me," he said simply. "And I always collect." Alejandro's stomach turned. "Owed you what?" "Money." The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let's just say, she promised me something. But instead of delivering, she ran like a coward, dragging that boy with her. She thought she could hide, but she was wrong. People like her always are." Alejandro's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. Elena hadn't just been running from fear, she had been running to protect Lucas from something far worse. "I won't let you hurt him," Alejandro said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The man smirked. "And what are you going to do about it? You're just a fool playing hero in a story that isn't yours." Alejandro leaned in, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Maybe. But I'd rather be a fool than a coward like you." He turned and walked away, his heart pounding as he left the cantina. The man's laughter followed him, echoing like a sinister promise. When Alejandro returned home, Lucas was waiting for him on the porch, his small hands clutching a bundle of wildflowers. He held them out silently, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Alejandro knelt, taking the flowers gently. "Thank you, Lucas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, looking him in the eye. "No matter what happens, I'm here for you. Always." Lucas nodded, his expression softening. For the first time, he reached out and wrapped his arms around Alejandro's neck in a tentative hug. It was a fragile, beautiful moment that Alejandro knew he would carry with him forever. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alejandro couldn't shake the feeling that the man's threats were far from empty. The shadows of the past were closing in, and the battle for Lucas's future was only just beginning. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. Alejandro stood by the window, staring into the darkness that surrounded the house. A single lantern burned on the table behind him, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Outside, The wind whispered through the trees, its mournful song carrying the weight of the confrontation that now felt inevitable. Lucas was asleep in the next room, his small figure buried beneath layers of blankets. Alejandro had checked on him several times, each time lingering a little longer, as if afraid that when he looked away, the boy might vanish. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind replaying the conversation at the cantina, the man's cold, cruel words cutting through him like a blade. He couldn't ignore the threat. The man, ruthless and unrelenting, was not the kind to make idle promises. Alejandro knew that Lucas's safety depended on his vigilance, on his willingness to stand firm against whatever storm was about to descend. The first sign of trouble came just before midnight. A faint rustling in the yard, too deliberate to be the wind, set Alejandro's senses on edge. He moved silently, grabbing the heavy wrench he kept by the door. His heart pounded as he peered through the window, his breath catching when he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, too large to be an animal. He turned and bolted the door, his mind racing. Whoever it was, they wouldn't stop at lurking in the shadows. They were here for Lucas, and Alejandro would be damned if he let them take the boy. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one heavier than the last. Then came the sound he had been dreading, the creak of the front porch, the deliberate scrape of a boot against the wooden planks. Alejandro's grip on the wrench tightened as he positioned himself near the door, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The door rattled violently, the knob twisting against the lock. Alejandro took a deep breath, his voice steady and loud as he called out, "I know you're there. Leave now, or you'll regret it." A deep, mocking laugh came from the other side. "Brave words," the man from the cantina drawled, his voice thick with malice. "Let's see if you're as brave when I come inside." The lock splintered under the force of a powerful kick, the door flying open to reveal the man, his broad frame silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Alejandro didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench with all his strength, the metal connecting with the man's arm. The intruder cursed, stumbling back, but his expression only darkened. "You think you can stop me?" the man snarled, his eyes burning with fury. "That boy belongs to me. Step aside." "He belongs to no one," Alejandro shot back, his voice firm and unyielding. "And you'll have to kill me before you lay a hand on him." The man lunged, and the room erupted into chaos. Alejandro fought with everything he had, the raw force of his determination outweighing his fear. The fight was brutal, the sound of fists and metal clashing echoing through the house. Alejandro felt pain explode in his ribs as the man landed a heavy blow, but he refused to falter. In the midst of the struggle, a small voice pierced the noise. "Papa." Lucas stood in the doorway of his room, his eyes wide with terror. The sight of the boy seemed to fuel Alejandro's resolve, giving him the strength to deliver a final, desperate strike that sent the man crashing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Alejandro turned to Lucas, his heart breaking at the fear etched into the boy's face. "It's okay," he said softly, kneeling and holding out his arms. "It's over." Lucas ran to him, clutching him tightly, his small body trembling. Alejandro held him close, his own tears mixing with the sweat and blood on his face. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I won't let anyone hurt you." The authorities arrived shortly after, summoned by a neighbor who had heard the commotion. The man was dragged away in handcuffs, his threats and curses fading into the distance. As the house fell quiet once more, Alejandro sank into a chair, cradling Lucas in his arms. The days that followed were a blur of healing and rebuilding. Alejandro knew the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to fade, but the bond between him and Lucas had grown unbreakable. The boy, once silent and withdrawn, began to speak more, his trust in Alejandro shining through in small, precious moments. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas reached for Alejandro's hand. "Papa," he said quietly, the word filled with a warmth that brought tears to Alejandro's eyes. "Yes, Mijo," Alejandro replied, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Lucas looked up at him, his dark eyes filled with a sense of peace Alejandro had never seen before. You kept your promise. Alejandro nodded, pulling Lucas into a gentle embrace. Always, he said. Siempre. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Alejandro realized that the house, once a place of abandonment and sorrow, had become a true home. And in Lucas, he had found not only a reason to fight but a reason to hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, love and courage could light the way forward.